All right, let's dive into some fascinating political territory today.
hmm
We're taking a look at the Green Party and their perspective on American democracy.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is we're going right to the source with this one. We've got Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential candidate, in conversation with Professor Jorge Majfood at Jacksonville University.
No secondhand analysis here.
Yep, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
And the timing is pretty incredible too, right?
Oh, absolutely. This was September 4th, 2024.
Right as the U.S. election was really heating up.
Talk about a pressure cooker.
So what kind of heat did Stein bring to this conversation?
Well, it all starts with some breaking news. A school shooting in Georgia.
Oh, wow.
And Stein, she uses this tragedy to immediately jump into a core Green Party concern.
Okay, which is?
The influence of powerful lobbies,
Uh-huh.
like the NRA, and how they impact gun control.
So she's not pulling any punches.
Not at all. She's not afraid to tackle these tough issues head on.
Does she connect this back to the broader political system at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Alex.
She uses it as a launching pad to critique the entire U.S. political system, actually,
Oh.
arguing that it's become, beholden to big money and has lost touch with everyday people.
That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
Does she back it up with any evidence?
She does. She cites a study from Northwestern and Princeton
Okay.
showing this massive disconnect between what the public actually wants and what Congress is actually getting done.
So if the system's rigged, as she suggests, then who's the Green Party fighting for?
Well, that's precisely the question that Professor Majfood asks.
Right.
And Stein's answer is crystal clear. The Green Party represents regular people, not lobbyists.
Okay, so how do they put that into practice? Like, what are some concrete examples that really set the Green Party apart?
Well, healthcare is a big one. Stein is a huge advocate for a Medicare for All system.
Okay.
She claims it would not only be more cost-effective, but also provide better care for everyone.
Makes sense.
Oh, and she drops a pretty shocking stat.
Okay, I'm listening.
A third of all healthcare dollars are just wasted on bureaucracy.
A third.
A third. Imagine all that money that could be going towards actual patient care.
Yeah, that's a staggering amount of money.
It is. And Stein argues that a single-payer system would streamline things,
Yeah.
free up those resources.
Okay, makes sense. So besides healthcare, what other key issues highlight the Green Party's distinct approach?
Well, Stein's a big proponent of ending what she calls endless wars.
Yeah.
She proposes a 50% reduction in military spending.
50%? That's a pretty drastic measure.
Yeah.
What's the reasoning behind such a significant cut?
Well, she argues that right now, half of all congressional funding is going towards the military.
Right.
Imagine if all those resources were redirected towards, say, education or healthcare or green initiatives.
Yeah.
It's about investing in our future, not just reacting to global conflict.
It's a fascinating perspective. I'll give her that.
It is. And speaking of investing in the future, Stein's also a staunch believer in free public higher education and student loan forgiveness.
That's sure to resonate with a lot of people, especially those struggling with student debt.
Oh, absolutely. And she connects this back to the GI Bill after World War II.
Oh, interesting.
Highlighting its economic benefits and how it boosted social mobility. She thinks a similar program could totally transform our economy and workforce today.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. Bold solutions to systemic problems. But can these solutions actually work within the existing political system?
That's where Professor Majfood raises a really important point.
Okay.
He expresses concern about the U.S. electoral system itself.
Uh-huh.
He argues that institutions like the Electoral College and the first-past-the-post voting system are inherently undemocratic.
I can see how those systems can be frustrating, especially for those who feel like their vote doesn't really count.
Totally. And Stein wholeheartedly agrees.
Really?
Yeah, she points to a Gallup poll that showed that a whopping 63% of Americans actually want more choices in their elections.
So they're tired of the two-party system.
Exactly. But if people are so dissatisfied, why don't they just vote for third-party candidates?
That's a good question.
Well, Stein actually has some firsthand experience with this. She describes the incredible lengths the Democratic Party went to keep her off the ballot in previous elections.
Seriously, what kind of tactics are we talking about?
Think armies of lawyers, exploiting technicalities, even accusations of spying and infiltration.
Whoa, that sounds like a political thriller.
It does, right?
So if third parties face these kinds of obstacles, is there any real hope for change within the system?
Well, Stein believes there is. She points to this growing abstention party.
Extension party.
Yeah, millions of eligible voters who are so disillusioned that they've just opted out of the whole process. She thinks this signals a tipping point
Interesting.
where people will finally demand a system that actually reflects their values.
So it's not just about offering an alternative, it's about fundamentally changing the rules of the game. That's a pretty powerful message.
Yeah.
But isn't speaking out against the establishment risky, especially in today's climate?
That leads us perfectly into the issue of censorship, which Professor Machfood brings up with some pretty alarming examples. He cites the fact that just 11 people were responsible for 60% of book bans in 2021-2022.
11 people. That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
What kind of books are we talking about here?
Well, he specifically mentions Florida's education system, where certain keywords related to Israel and Palestine were flagged for review,
Okay.
leading to the banning of courses that dealt with these topics.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy-handed approach to controlling information.
It is, and Stein sees this as part of a larger pattern.
What do you mean?
She connects it to her own experience, being labeled a Russian agent just because of her anti-war stance.
Oh, wow.
She argues that dissenting voices are being systematically silenced.
Okay.
And she points to cases like Julian Assange and the Uhuru movement as further evidence of this trend.
So we're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all seemingly under attack.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. So what's the solution? How do we push back against these trends?
Well, Stein believes that reclaiming our democracy and empowering people to vote for what they truly believe in is essential. She actually ends this part of the conversation with a powerful quote from Frederick Douglass. "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will."
It's a call to action for sure.
That is.
So how does she propose we translate that energy into concrete action?
That's a great question, and it leads us perfectly into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring the Green Party's vision for a different kind of foreign policy,
Okay.
one that prioritizes diplomacy, human rights, and international law.
This is getting really interesting. I'm hooked.
Stay with us. All right, so ready to delve into the Green Party's stance on foreign policy. It's a pretty different look than what we usually see.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially after hearing Stein's criticism of U.S. interventionism. I feel like she's advocating for a complete reimagining of America's role in the world.
Exactly. And Professor Machfood really lays the groundwork here. He kind of outlines the whole history of U.S. involvement in Latin America,
Oh,
painting a picture of, regime change, military influence, a real focus on power over people.
so he's providing context for Stein's critique.
Precisely. Highlighting how U.S. foreign policy has often been driven by self-interest, not necessarily the well-being of other nations.
Right. Okay. So how does Stein address this history of intervention?
She doesn't hold back, that's for sure. She uses some pretty strong examples like, the overthrow of democratically elected governments in Guatemala and Iran.
Those are some pretty heavy historical examples.
Oh, yeah, she's not mincing words.
So what does she say the consequences of these actions are?
Stein argues that they create instability,
Okay.
fuel resentment towards the U.S.,
Huh.
and ultimately just completely backfire,
In what way?
leading to more global insecurity, failed states, and the rise of extremist groups.
So it sounds like she's saying that trying to impose our will on other countries actually creates more problems than it solves.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the Green Party offers a radically different approach.
Okay, tell me more.
They call for a shift away from military might,
Okay.
and instead prioritizing diplomacy, international law, and human rights.
Right. Okay. But, is that realistic? Can a country as powerful as the U.S. really operate on those principles in a world where everyone else is just vying for power?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's especially relevant right now.
How so?
Well, look at what's happening globally.
Yeah.
We've got hot wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Tensions with China are rising. It feels like we're on the precipice of a whole new era of conflict.
So how does the Green Party think we should navigate all of this?
Well, Stein argues that this idea of a unipolar world, where the U.S. is the dominant superpower, is outdated and dangerous. She's calling for a multipolar world instead.
What's that?
Basically, one where power is more evenly distributed and everyone's focused on cooperation.
So moving away from this America First mindset towards a more collaborative approach.
Exactly. But you're right, it wouldn't be an easy transition.
No, it sounds like a huge cultural shift.
But Stein argues it's a more realistic approach and ultimately a safer one, especially when you consider that so many nations now possess incredibly destructive weapons.
Yeah, that makes sense. The stakes are just too high for these old power struggles. So how does all this talk about diplomacy and human rights actually translate into specific policies?
Well, let's look at immigration as an example. Professor Machfood brings this up, and he frames it in a way that really challenges some common assumptions.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of perspective does he offer?
He starts by pointing out that, statistically, undocumented immigrants actually have lower crime rates than U.S. citizens.
Oh, interesting. So he's pushing back against that narrative that immigrants are inherently dangerous.
Exactly. He also critiques U.S. immigration laws, arguing that they favor the wealthy, making things unnecessarily difficult for hardworking individuals who just want a better life.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more humane system. What's Stein's take on this?
Well, her approach is all about addressing the root causes of immigration.
Okay, rather than just trying to keep people out.
Right. She's looking at the big picture, the underlying reasons why people leave their homes in the first place.
Okay, so what are some of those root causes?
Well, first, she talks about ending these regime change operations that destabilize nations.
Right, taking responsibility for the effects of U.S. interventionism. Anything else?
Oh, yeah, treating drug use as a public health issue rather than a criminal one.
To help undermine the cartels.
Exactly, ending economic sanctions on countries like Cuba and Venezuela.
Okay, so she's connecting a lot of these seemingly disparate issues together.
Yeah, it's a very holistic approach, recognizing that immigration is a complex issue. And it's not just about addressing those root causes, it's also about creating a more welcoming environment for immigrants here in the U.S.
So what would that look like? How would the Green Party change the way we treat immigrants once they get here?
Stein proposes a pretty radical idea.
Okay, lay it on me.
Diverting the billions of dollars we spend on, ineffective border walls, and instead funding support systems for immigrants.
Like what kinds of support systems?
Things like legal aid, language classes, job training, recognizing the contributions that immigrants make,
Right.
both economically and culturally, and actually creating a system that welcomes them instead of fearing them.
So it's about moving away from this purely reactive approach to immigration towards a more proactive and humane one.
Exactly. And that brings us to maybe the most controversial topic of this whole conversation.
Hit me with it.
The Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Okay, now that is a sensitive one. I'm interested to hear how Stein approaches this.
Professor Machfood brings it up by referencing Trump's statement linking support for Palestine with un-American values.
Wow, talk about a loaded statement. It feels like he's trying to shut down any dissenting opinions right there.
Yeah, and it immediately raises that whole issue of conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Which is often used to silence people who speak out against the occupation.
So how does Stein handle this?
Well, she's very clear in distinguishing between Zionism, the political ideology, and Judaism, the religion.
So she's saying criticizing the Israeli government isn't the same as criticizing Jewish people or their faith.
Exactly. She emphasizes this long history of peaceful coexistence, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Palestine. It was really the arrival of the Zionist movement that ignited the conflict.
Okay, so if the conflict isn't inherently religious, what solution does Stein propose?
She calls for a solution based on international law and human rights.
Meaning?
Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the West Bank, the end of the occupation, and the system of apartheid that's been imposed on Palestinians.
That's a pretty bold stance, considering the level of U.S. support for Israel. Does she acknowledge that this would be a difficult path?
Oh, absolutely. But she points out that the U.S. has a lot of power to influence the situation.
Okay.
She cites historical examples like Reagan and Eisenhower, who were able to pressure Israel to change course.
So it's not impossible. There's precedent for this. But how does she propose we actually do it? What would a Green Party administration do?
Well, Stein's Day One plan involves cutting off military aid to Israel until it complies with international law and ends the occupation.
Wow, that's a big move for sure.
It is, but it really shows their commitment to human rights over, political maneuvering.
This conversation is bringing up so many important questions about how America operates in the world.
It really is. It's a lot to digest. Should we maybe take a step back and try to unpack some of what we've learned?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm curious to hear your take on all of this. Okay, so we've really gone deep on this one, exploring the Green Party's vision for America.
Yeah, from healthcare and education to, completely rethinking our role in the world. Stein definitely isn't afraid of shaking things up.
It is a lot to take in, though, right?
Right.
I mean, how does all of this impact, the average person?
That's the key question, right? It's got to be about more than just abstract policy ideas.
Yeah, for sure. So for our listeners, what are the main takeaways here? What should they be considering after this conversation?
I think a big one for me is like remembering that your voice matters.
Yeah.
Even if you're, totally disillusioned by the current system, your vote is still a powerful tool.
It's easy to feel like one vote doesn't really change anything, especially when it seems like the two big parties are calling all the shots. But Stein's perspective is like a reminder that there are other options out there.
And the fact that so many people are unhappy with the two-party system, that's actually a good thing.
Really?
It shows that people want something different.
Yeah.
They want a system that actually represents them.
So it's like dissatisfaction can lead to positive change.
Exactly. And Stein's perspective kind of gives us a roadmap, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about voting. It's about being an active citizen, like in every part of your life.
So what does that actually look like?
It starts with being engaged in your community.
Okay.
Going to town halls, speaking out against things that are wrong, supporting local groups that are working for change.
Being informed and engaged, using your voice.
Exactly. And it's not just about the big splashy stuff either.
Right.
Even small things can make a difference. Supporting businesses that align with your values, making sustainable choices in your everyday life, having those tough conversations with friends and family.
Yeah, it all matters.
Yeah, it's realizing that we all have a part to play in creating a better world.
I like that, recognizing our individual power.
And, even if you don't agree with all of Stein's policies, I think her perspective is really valuable just for getting people thinking critically, questioning assumptions, challenging the way things are, imagining different possibilities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big question you want our listeners to be thinking about?
Here's one. If more people felt like they could vote for what they actually believed in, without fear or limitations, how would that change the political landscape?
That's a really powerful question. It's making me think about a world where the people actually have the power, not just the powerful.
And isn't that a world worth fighting for?
100%. So that's our deep dive into American democracy and the Green Party's vision for a different future.
We hope this conversation has given you some new things to consider, maybe sparked some curiosity, maybe even inspired you to get involved.
Because knowledge is power, but only if we use it. So keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world.
We'll see you next time.